I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on vendor selection. My name is Arlene Itori, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute, and it is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Sylvan Advisory and GlobeSource partners. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. But before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you about a few tools that you'll be able to use throughout today's session. First, we encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the submit button. During today's presentation, there will be a poll question to get to know you better and to help ensure that the content is relevant to your specific needs. When the poll appears, be sure to select the answer that best fits the question. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to today's speakers. We have Paul Pinto, Managing Partner of Sylvan Advisory with us, and Donald Moniz, Managing Director of GlobeSource Partners with us. I'd like to now allow the gentlemen to say a few words about themselves. Paul?
Great. Thank you, Arlene. Hi, this is Paul Pinto. I'm a managing partner at Sylvan Advisory. I've been with Sylvan as the founder for the last 5 years. Prior to that, I've done quite a bit of work in outsourcing advisory. I've got over 26 years of experience, and one of my claims to fame is I've made 28 trips to India and Asia, and have served as an expert witness on some pretty high-profile trial cases. Donald, could I ask you to introduce yourself as well, please?
Sure. Well, hello to everyone. My name is Donald Moniz. I'm currently working with my own consulting company, GlobeSource Partners. I was previously with McGraw-Hill Companies. In both positions, my focus has been outsourcing everything from the vendor selection to the transition and transformation of outsourcing, whether it's onshore or offshore.
Okay, and I'd like to just say a few words about the Outsourcing Institute if you're not familiar with us. The Outsourcing Institute has a network of outsourced professionals. OI is a good source of information, advice, best practices on outsourcing. We offer training through OI University. OI has an RFP builder and related tools if you're interested. We also have a sister company called CMS where we recruit outsourcing professionals. We have a new RPO channel you can check out on our website. If you're interested in sponsorship and new business development opportunities and programs, please let us know. You can visit us at outsourcing.com or email us at info@outsourcing.com. Now I'd like to share with you a couple of roadshow events we have on December 8th in New York City and Houston. I'd also like to add that Donald Moniz, who is with us today, will be chairing the New York event. The theme of the events is Innovation Through Outsourcing, the sequel. If you live in these areas or will be visiting these cities during this time, please visit us at outsourcing.com/roadshow for more details. Now I'd like to turn it over to Paul Pinto to begin today's presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Arlene. So today we're going to go through really just about, 15, 16 slides. So please appreciate this. This isn't death by PowerPoint. The intent here is to talk about the vendor selection process, give you just a little bit of context, talk about some of the top 5 reasons why we see the currently run vendor selection processes fail. And I don't mean a hard failure, but fail to meet the established objectives. And then go through a different approach to selecting a vendor that we've seen work in the industry, especially over the last 2 years, and then cite some of the actual tacit benefits that we've seen about employing a new process. I'll be acting as the master of ceremonies and taking you through the content on the slides. Donald is going to be contributing with real-life experiences that he's seen from the buy side as well as the sell side, and introducing your questions. So Arlene, if we could go to the next slide, please. So by way of context, the outsourcing life cycle is vast, right? It starts with a concept of what to outsource, where to outsource, how to outsource, What's the venue? Do I do it internal? Do I do it with a captive? Do I look to select a vendor partner, which is in the lower left-hand corner in purple? After a deal is struck between a buyer and a seller, it goes into governance, really the transition, and then steady state. And how do you manage risk and quality and issues and change and throughout the rest of its life cycle. All we're focusing on today in our discussion is the area highlighted in purple, so the external sourcing process. So there's an assumption made that you've gathered the requirements, you know that this is something you want to outsource, you appreciate and have a business case that says you should outsource this or could outsource this, and now you need to find a vendor to outsource this to. So we're not addressing the precursor of developing a business case, and we're not addressing anything after the close of the engagement. But we're pristinely focused on going through that vendor selection process and conducting mutual due diligence, and ideally picking the best suited vendor. Next slide, please. So today, we did an analysis on 2011, which we're at the very end of here, and there's roughly over 300,000 outsourcing transactions that will be conducted around vendor selection. It essentially breaks up into thirds. Around 38% are existing engagements that are renewed with the incumbent, and we've all been in that scenario where we bid on engagements where the incumbent has won them. So incumbents still tend to win those engagements. 27% are awarded to new vendors. And by the way, every year contracts come up for renewal, and in a number of cases, acting as an advisor, we recommend that they be outsourced to somebody other than the incumbent for a variety of reasons. And 35% of new engagements, this is part of the new growth in the industry, go to new vendors. So the vendor selection process is run over and over and over, and it's executed at varying degrees of success or failure. Donald, any comments to add?
Oh, absolutely. So I think one of the key things that I look at from coming from the buy side is we know that the incumbent and the existing strategic vendor is in there. They understand our business. And what I've tried to do and what I've told people that they really need to try and do is leverage that existing vendor, but not to the point where it's a de facto standard that they get the additional work, but recognize that there are some benefits and there are some risks about going with incumbent vendors. And I think the thing you have to look at is if you go with a new vendor and go through a new process like this, there is going to be an expense to going with a new vendor, especially if they haven't done work with your firm before. So you really need to balance that out. And these numbers are important to see, but you've got to look at your internal operations, whether it's a complex environment or whether it's a very standard environment. And those are going to be factors as well, depending on how much you want to leverage a new vendor during this process.
Yeah, Donald, you make a really good point. One of the trends we've seen over the last year is that incoming vendors, in order to unseat an incumbent, they're willing to eat the cost of transition, so the buyer doesn't pay a double bubble. So it's a really interesting tact we've seen employed, and successfully, by the way. Arlene, next slide, please.
Paul, would you like to do our poll question now? That seems to be a good spot.
Please.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and do the poll question. Thank you.
Sounds good.
So if you could, take a look at the poll question, and it's, are you contemplating a selection of a new vendor? So if you are with your existing vendor and you have a long-term contract and you're not planning on breaking that contract prematurely, then the answer would be no. But if you're planning on over the next 6 months through 3 years, if you could please respond to the question. Interestingly enough, you know, if you think about it, the market's growing at a CAGR of around 6%. The average contract length is a little over a year. Obviously, there are some leftover 10-year contracts. Most of the managed service stuff goes for 5 years. There's quite a lot of 1-year and 3-year contracts, but there's also a number of fixed fee deals that are 6 months long. Okay, we have the results back from the survey, and 44% said no. And interesting, Very few said 18, well, none, very few said 18 months. And there's a few that said yes in the next 36. Great, thank you. Arlene?
So it's interesting when you look at, as I say, when you look at these kind of polls. I mean, from my perspective, if you look back 5 years ago, we had a lot of people that were very dissatisfied with the existing vendors. There's a lot of immaturity in the market in terms of how people were looking at new vendors, and to see that 44% are basically satisfied with existing vendors or looking to expand their relationship with existing vendors is a very positive sign. On the other side, when you see that I think it was 36% are looking for new vendors, you know, it's always important to break that up in terms of looking at new vendors. I looked at new vendors because I wanted to go to a different market. I wanted to move out of India, and I potentially wanted to look at a company that was focused on the Philippines or focused on a different technology. So that drove a lot to it. So I think it's really important that we think about, if you look into a new vendor, what is the purpose of the vendor? Is it you're unhappy with the existing one, or you're looking for a way of spreading out your risks a little bit more?
Yeah, Donald, that's a great point, especially around the alternate geographies. We have seen an influx to find, or an interest to find alternatives to India. We've seen a number of geographies pop up and companies in those geographies. So that certainly is one of the factors contributing to the new vendor selections. Very quickly, if you take a look at everything that goes on as part of a vendor selection process, obviously you've got the buyer and the vendor, but not to be discounted are a number of influencers like the Outsourcing Institute and a number of advisors. And these advisors come in many forms. They could be outsourcing advisors, such as myself and Donald, or they could be legal advisors. So there's a lot of players who can get involved in a relationship, all of which should lead to some sort of contractual agreement. Now, we've seen a trend in what we call do-it-yourself outsourcing, where the buyers are sophisticated enough or mature enough to administer an RFP and vendor selection process themselves with very little help from influencers or advisors. And that's actually worked quite well when they've been enabled with the right set of tools. Donald, any comments?
Yeah, actually, there was a couple of questions that came in, and I wanted to just to talk a little bit about the vendor selection, because the question is preferred vendors amongst the current vendor portfolios. If not, basically, how would you look to differentiate between vendor tiering? And vendor tiering is really important in terms of the different markets that you have, and it's something that I don't know if we're going to go through in detail about how you would tier the vendor. But what I always look for is there's three ways that we look to tier vendors. One is in terms of size, where you don't want any vendor to be more than, let's say, 40 or 50% of your portfolio. The second is looking at different market directions or different technologies, where we look to have different technology stacks provided to different vendors. And then the third is we look for any comparable. If you're doing development, you don't want the same company to do testing. So we look to separate those in terms of tiering. So there's different ways of looking at it from a financial as well as a delivery perspective. The other thing we talked about is geography. And I'm hearing a lot about geography in terms of alternatives are growing, both within an existing strategic vendor going to a new market, let's say Wipro going from India to Argentina, or Cognizant doing the same, and being an opportunity to leverage your selection that way. But I also see that more buyers are looking to go into markets with companies that focus on those geographic areas as a vendor. So we want to do business in Mexico, and we want a company that's based in Mexico, is something that I've been hearing a lot more of.
Great, thank you. Arlene, next slide, please. So let's get into some of the top reasons why the vendor selection process fails to drive against the original goals and objectives. Next slide, please, Arlene. And this list has been accumulated over the last 3 years across literally hundreds of vendor selection processes. So if we look at the number 5 reason, and this comes under the heading of time kills all deals. Right, the typical vendor selection process runs between 6 and 9 months. Now, I understand that there are some processes that can go very quick when you are selecting to buy a small software product, and that could be a 2-month or 3-month vendor selection process. We've seen vendor selections go on as much as 2 years, and obviously over that much time, the business requirements would have changed beyond those that are being researched as part of the process. So this 6 to 9 month time frame has become essentially intolerable by the business. The business is really looking for something more in the 3 to 4 month time frame. But the longer it goes, the greater the likelihood of your knees getting kicked out from under you as part of executing against an RFP or a vendor selection process.
Right. And Paul, I mean, my experience has been is that you have to be very careful with these kind of time frames when you're doing vendor selection, depending on if this is new to your company in terms of how you've outsourced. If it's the first large project, you want to take it slow. You want to find a partner that's willing to take it slow. If you've been doing this for a long time, you should be able to execute the thing fairly quickly, and you should be able to know if you could do an outsourcing task or project within 3 to 6 months. My fear that I always see is when you believe something would take 12 months and you have a vendor that comes in and says they could do it for 6 months with minimum transition problems or impacts, and that always makes me very concerned. So I think through the vendor selection, the process is you have to remember that you know your company and your culture very well. The vendor doesn't necessarily do that. So they can make promises and they can make contractual promises, but you have to be a little realistic in terms of what really can happen and what kind of impact you need in your operation or you would expect or tolerate during a transition.
So Donald, ignoring the transition for a second, if we just focused on the vendor selection process, right? So you've got your requirements, and now you've got to go ahead and select a vendor. So get a long list to a short list, see the vendors, call them down, do mutual due diligence. What's the longest you've experienced where it's still resulted in something meaningful?
Oh, I've been involved in 2-year transitions that were supposed to be, well, from the vendor selection process, when a vendor said they could do it in 6 months to a year, because due diligence is never 100%, and no new vendor can experience or expect the or see the unknown. There's always a challenge there. So I've seen projects go 2 years because of new occurrences or because the business has changed. And I think during the vendor selection, one of the things that also misses what happens if your company during the selection process or post-selection process, you have acquisitions or divestitures. And how does that impact your selection process? So those are the kind of things you need to consider as well. But I've seen as short as weeks, and I've seen as long as years.
Great, thank you, Donald. Next slide, please. So the fourth most likely reason for the process to fail to meet the objectives is far too often we've witnessed the development of an RFP and the quantitative selection of a preferred vendor to be viewed as a substitute for doing actual due diligence, qualitative analysis on the vendor. Right? Far too many times this has occurred where numerically a vendor is chosen based on weighting and rating in a spreadsheet of a variety of categories, while yet that vendor may be a poor cultural fit for the organization and results in a failed transition and or a failed project. Donald, have you seen that in your experience?
Yeah, due diligence is the Achilles heel of many of the selection processes because I'm a very big fan of leveraging strategic vendors, and the reason is because due diligence is what always keeps me up at night. Am I as a buyer providing all the information during the process for selection that a vendor needs to be able to give me a good proposal? And on the other hand, does the vendor really have the experience of doing a thorough due diligence on the technology, on the business process that I'm trying to outsource? So it's a very difficult thing to be able to do, especially during the evaluation process, because many times I don't want to give all the information because some of it may not be very good, and I'm going through an evaluation with maybe 5 or 10 vendors, and it's a lot to disclose. So you've got to make sure you have NDAs signed, and you have to have a very, very tight legal aspect of your evaluation process. So it's a very difficult thing to do, and I've heard more complaints about we've given all the information to the vendor, but they still didn't get it right. And that's why this is such a difficult area.
Yeah, the other component of due diligence is it's really bilateral. It's not simply the buyer doing due diligence on the seller, right? It's the seller doing due diligence on the buyer and the deal to make sure that it's truly something that makes sense to them. Right. So it really is a two-way street.
Right. So let me I'm sorry, Paul. There's
Yep.
a couple of questions I just want to jump into because we're getting quite a few questions here. When I say provider, and when I speak of provider, we are talking about the vendor. So because there were a couple of questions about that. And Paul, another question came up regarding how do we qualify a vendor to receive an RFP? There's a lot of sales mumbo jumbo, so to speak, and being able to cut through that sales cycle to be able to do good evaluation is a challenge that I'm seeing a bunch of questions come through on.
Yeah, so I'd like to hold that question because we've got some slides that talk directly to that point. So if we don't answer that, please come back and ask again.
Okay.
Arlene, next slide, please. So let's go to the number 3 reason, right? Poor list of potential vendors, both long list and short list. So, a formal process says do an RFI, put out an RFI to get a long list of vendors. Put it out to 7 or 8. And then from that list and understanding their capabilities, cull it down to a short list of 3 or 4, and then put out an RFP to those 3 or 4. Realizing today there are 50,000 vendors in the market pointed at the U.S., trying to sell in the U.S. today. Us as individuals, we may know 6 or 7 of those vendors. Maybe, even acting as an advisor, I know 20 vendors off the top of my head. There are still a number of highly qualified, capable vendors that reside, I'll call it tier 2, who are very credible, financially sound, who do wonderful work. Now, I'm not espousing tier 2 vendors are the right answer for everything. It depends on what you want to outsource and how big of an organization you are and a number of other things. But you've got to appreciate there are a lot of vendors out there in a lot of different geographies. Now, we just did an engagement where the winning vendor ended up being located in Bangladesh, where they had incredible capabilities to do remote server monitoring at a cost per server per month. And they had tremendous qualifications in that area of doing server farms of thousands of Unix servers. They were a very good choice for this buyer. So far too often, we see clients develop a short list too quickly based on the vendors they know historically without really doing a market scan to see what's out there.
Yeah,
Donald?
and coming from the buy side, it's always been a challenge that you have in terms of how big the list should be and how small the list is. And I think the reality that I've seen is I have to look at the time frame that I need to transition. I have to look at the risks and the business value that I get from these projects. So if I go with a list of 20 companies that I need to whittle down, it's going to take me more time. And the reality is that you want to make sure you get the right vendors, but it's also based on what you need to do as a company in terms of getting that value creation from the outsourcing. And I also am a big fan of that, the whole idea between talking to our peers, looking at other companies, who are they using, who they had good experiences with, and I also like to do reference checks before I even start this process, just to make sure if we are going to put a company on the list that's new, that they have a good reputation going in, and it helps keep the list shorter, because as a buyer, I want to get the list short, but many times we want to go and not exclude people that might be good providers, and that's the biggest challenge that I've seen as well.
All right, let's go on to the number 2 answer. Arlene, please. So the number 2 reason, and this is by far and away one of my favorites, is far too often we see the vendor selection process being led by procurement, and it's not my intent to denigrate procurement. I'm a fan of procurement, right? But far too often it's led by procurement, and it's simply focused on the lowest cost provider. And I tell clients all the time, be careful what you wish for, because you may actually get it. Right? If you want the lowest cost provider, you may actually get the lowest cost provider. And in doing so, you will endure, in more cases than not, issues with quality. And we've seen that in this industry, far, far too often. When one vendor outbids another vendor and lowballs it to make sure they can take the bid, but hasn't included enough profit for them to staff it correctly, and then they start experiencing high levels of attrition, and the quality goes down, and everything spirals down from there. As part of the vendor selection process, when we get involved, we actually require the vendors to submit copies of their P&Ls We want to see what their average profit margin is. Now, obviously, if it's a publicly traded firm, that information is readily available. But even private companies, we ask for that because we want to make sure that the engagement that they're proposing is profitable to them. We want them to make money. We know that if this deal is less profitable than other deals, then the A players are going to go on those other engagements. And our deal is going to get the C players. So,
yeah.
Go ahead, Donald, please.
I'll just jump in. So, and I think that's a key point. So when the reality is that and procurement has a great value in this process, but being on the business side of the outsourcing, two things come up. Am I outsourcing an area that produces revenue? And if I go with the cheapest provider, do they help or hurt my possibility of developing revenue-generating operations? And that's a big concern. So if you go with a company that has a higher cost, will they provide you more innovation? And I look for that as part of the deal. The other side is if I'm looking at just like an infrastructure, a pure cost-based outsourcing, then I feel that having procurement push harder on the pricing has less risk to my organization. So I really always balance this kind of question in terms of, am I looking for revenue production or am I looking for really cost takeout? And that's where you want to balance this out very importantly as well. And profit margin is important, and I've been in too many situations where if company A is looking for resources with strong financial background and I'm competing with companies that are willing to pay a higher profit margin, I'm not going to get the best and the brightest. And just like we've seen on different shows and movies, I'm going to get the B players because they're going to move the best players to the A companies that are willing to pay a little bit more margin to get the best and the brightest. And that's a big issue, and that's reality. So the fact you can get anything you want in the contract, but the reality is the best and the brightest go to where they make the most money.
You know, we get called in a lot to do audits on existing deals, and we always look to develop a value calculation for the services provided, and more often than not, it is higher value to pay more and get more than it is to pay less and get much less. We've seen that as a significant trend. Next slide, please. So let's go to the top reasons why the vendor selection process fails. Is more times than not, the vendor has a very capable salesperson leading the charge. And that very capable salesperson, when they're really talented, they've got the ability to make that vendor solution appear in the brightest light possible. If they're going against another vendor who's got a B-level or a C-level salesperson, far too often as a buyer, we get sucked in by that sales appeal of that salesperson. And we see this quite a lot. And it's really not necessarily indicative of the company's delivery capabilities or the cultural fit. You just become enamored with the salesperson. Right? More often than not, a salesperson will try to establish a relationship with the buyer. And you know, please remember, there's a whole science to selling. Right? Who the key buyers are, who the influencers are, how can you build a relationship with the key buyers, how can you build a relationship with the key influencers, what are the touch points, how many touch points do you have to have before they're willing to buy. Right? There's folks who dedicate their careers to understanding how to sell to a buyer. And the ones who are very sophisticated and do it very well can make a less attractive product and or service look very attractive.
Right.
Donald?
So absolutely, you know, the sales guy comes in, he looks really great, or she looks really great, and she's presenting really well. The two things that I do during the evaluation process that seem to work very well is one is I require that delivery is included from the day we start talking. So if the salesperson won't provide you a delivery person, a real person on the delivery side, that's a caution, and that should be a weighting within your evaluation criteria. Engagement of delivery in the sales cycle, very important. The second is ask the salesperson how they get compensated. Do they get compensated on the deal value when it gets signed, or do they get compensated on the deal over the next 2 years, or whatever the extent of the contract is? The reason I ask those questions, especially the second one, is because if the salesperson gets paid and compensated based on the value of the contract at signature time, then they have no long-term vested interest, and that's a warning sign. And I would also have a weighting of that in the evaluation process as well. And those are the two things that seem to work very well when you're afraid that the sales are not going to match what's on the delivery side.
Great. Those are great points. Arlene, next slide, please. All right, now that we've talked about the top 5 reasons why the vendor selection process fails, let's go through what a preferred approach to vendor selection would be. Next slide, please, Arlene. So if you take a look at a modified process, and we talked earlier about the standard process, which includes going to 6 to 9 vendors, doing an RFI, then getting those responses in and calling through those, determining who to send it out to an RFP, which, again, the preferred approach is 2 to 3 for an RFP. I can't tell you how many times I've seen clients put out RFPs to 9 vendors, and first of all, the RFP isn't very well written. It's not written well enough for a vendor to respond to, which is a frequent complaint we hear from the vendor side. 2, sending it out to 8 or 9 vendors makes all the other vendors think about if they want to bid and should they waste their time in potentially putting a bid together that could be anybody's and could go to the lowest price provider. So what we like to do is encourage clients to use an accelerated approach. And we'll get into some of the techniques that'll accelerate this process. But in essence, it's put out an RFP, make sure you've got the business requirements, make sure you've got a business case that's signed off on. You've already made the determination of what the requirements are, what the return on investment is, whether to insource or outsource. You've determined to outsource. You've done some diligence on what the right venue is, the geographic location, and who the players are. And instead of going to a long list to a short list, there's market research available today through folks like the Outsourcing Institute that can get you a short list very quickly and save you a step. Then facilitate a bilateral due diligence, not unilateral. Also, in parallel, include the contract negotiations. So front-end load that activity, whereas in the past it was always back-end loaded. And then select a vendor. Donald?
Yeah, so I think the key thing that I look at, and it always makes me nervous when we talk about the vendor list, and from a buyer perspective, from a large corporation perspective, we always have our preferred list, and we always try and look at accelerating the process by looking at who the vendors are that we can do business with, meaning who we already have signed agreements with, and that's really important. One of the things that I also noticed, and Paul, you mentioned about sending this out to a certain amount of vendors, giving them enough time to respond, especially the new vendors versus your existing preferred vendors, is really an important category. And I always think that you want to give the new vendor ample time to respond effectively, but then also you want to be able to give the preferred vendor kind of the leg up because they have that institutional knowledge already. And that's always been a struggle of mine, to try and figure out how do you balance those two issues when you go through an RFI of a new project.
So let's go a little bit more deeper into the preferred approach. Arlene, next slide, please. So what's it really come down to? At the end of the day, it's around math, physics, and chemistry. The math is the pricing, and everybody understands the pricing. I want to say that again. Everybody understands the pricing. And more often than not, deals are awarded based solely on price, which is problematic. But outside of pricing, the next level of understanding goes to the physics of the deal, or the fit. Is this vendor capable of doing what I've asked them to do? And have they proven that to me in more than words out of a salesperson's mouth? The third level is really around the chemistry. Is this vendor the right fit for me as an organization? And we see this very typically ignored. So a lot of small-sized buyers or mid-tier buyers, I'll say, for example, I've got a client who's a $400 million a year media company, and they wanted to outsource all of IT. So they immediately thought of the big 3 offshore vendors. And we said, wait a minute, why do you want to do business with a company that does $6 billion a year, and you're going to do $2 million with them? You're going to be a very small fish in a very big pond. Wouldn't it be better if you did business with a $400 or $500 million a year IT outsourcing firm where you would be one of the top 20% clients and get the A players? And a lot of clients don't necessarily think about the fit between the buying company and the selling company. Secondarily to that is, what level of access do you have to the senior executives in that firm? Can you call the right level of person in that company, if something goes bump in the night? And by the way, something always goes bump in the night. These engagements never transition cleanly. They never run, full SLAs in the first year. So there's always something that has to be saved for these to work. So you've got to have access to the right level of management from the seller's perspective. Donald?
Right. Thanks, Paul. So I agree with you on the pricing, and I think you got to be very careful on the pricing where you try and lowball a price because you know what they pay per, $15 an hour per person or $10, and you try and get it for $8. That's something that you have to understand that's going to have direct impact. In terms of the physics, you need to make sure that the vendors that you're choosing have the capabilities today, have the capabilities in a year from now, and that the focus of what you want them to do, let's say it's financial services, web design, mobility, that they're not just getting into mobility just to satisfy your need, that mobility is part of their corporate culture. They've been doing it for a while. They have a high percentage of employees dedicated to the task that you want to have done. So that's very important to have proven. And I always look at the Wipros and TCS of what percentage of their staff is involved with QA, or what percentage of their staff is involved with development of mobility and support of mobility. So that's a very important thing that I look for. Chemistry is so critical because, like Paul said, things go bump in the night. You want to be able to have that they understand your business. They have the same passion as your business. The culture of what you do and how you do it is very similar. And it's important to be able to use that as an important idea. Now, you can get the math right, you can get the physics right, but if the chemistry is not right, it's a horrible experience because of the relationship management side of it. But I also want to focus on the chemistry of, I hire a company because I like the salesperson or I like the CEO. And it's a big danger to hire a vendor based on one or two bodies, one or two people in the organization that you like. I've been to too many events, too many sessions where people said, I like this company because the people are great. They used to work for another company, and I know they moved over, and they're really good. If that person wins the lottery and leaves tomorrow, are you still going to want to do business with that company? And I think that's a very important category that you don't want to look for. And many C-level people are saying, I want to deal with a certain company because they have great capabilities. It's got to be the depth of that organization that you've got to be dealing with because you want a 3-year relationship with them, and the chemistry's got to be right. Paul?
Yeah, again, we do a lot of audits. We also do a lot of remediations. And when we're called in to remediate a bad situation, it's typically because of the lack of cultural fit or lack of chemistry between the buyer and the seller. Right? The math was still the math, and typically buyers do a good job, typically they do a good job of assessing the capabilities of the vendor. But where it goes awry is when there's just a mismatch between cultures, mismatch between chemistry. And that's tough to repair, almost impossible. Next slide, please, Arlene. So one of the things we like to espouse is the use of an outsourcing accelerator tool. And there's a number of tools in the market today that can help you with the entire process of selecting a vendor. The Outsourcing Institute happens to author one of those tools called the Outsourcing Accelerator, oddly enough. And this tool takes you through the RFP process with a preset set of requirements. So you answer a few questions about what you want to outsource and the size of your organization, and the tool shows you best-of-breed requirements. It'll show you SLAs, it'll show you scope statements, and you choose which ones make the most sense for your scenario. You can edit them, you could add your own as you see fit, and then actually invite vendors to bid electronically. So instead of sending out paper RFPs, you invite them to bid electronically. They submit their bids, they ask their questions electronically. You could hold your forums, your vendor meetings electronically as well. Once you get all their submissions in, you then have the ability in the same tool to do the quantitative analysis, the rating and weighting of the vendor responses and compare them to each other. This isn't a substitute for qualitative analysis. It's not a substitute for bilateral due diligence, but it does automate all the processes associated with vendor selection. Once a vendor is selected, you can then literally hit the button and tell it which vendor's proposal you want to use as the basis for developing the contracts. So the tool then goes forth and develops a best-in-class master services agreement and all the associated schedules, the statement of work and the non-competes and the privacy schedules. So it can actually save you quite a lot of time. Again, the issue we've seen is too many clients think by using the tool they don't have to do due diligence and they don't have to assess the chemistry. All the tool does is help you assess the physics and perhaps the math. Donald, have you had any specific experience using any of the Accelerator tools?
No, I haven't. But I think one of the questions that come up in terms of when do these kind of tools come in helpful if you are helpful if you have a big staff that kind of does this on your own. And I think the benefit of these kind of tools is consistency, and from the vendor side, they know what to expect. So I think there's a lot of good advantages to doing this. Even if you've been doing RFPs for a long time, I've done a lot with Excel spreadsheets. And when you get those numbers in, you're trying to get things standard, it's very difficult. So I think these are kind of things that, as I go forward, I'm going to look more towards because I want to make sure that I get very consistent development of RFIs and RFPs.
Yeah, you know, what do we usually see for RFPs? It's a Word-based document that's been cut and pasted, right? It's 25 to 30 pages that very few vendors will actually read the whole thing. You get a response from a vendor, which, you know, from a vendor's perspective, the rule is if the buyer submits 5 pages, you respond with 5 pages. If the buyer submits 30 pages, you respond with 30 pages. So you get 30 pages back from 4 or 5 vendors, and you've got to distribute and read all of those. And then you move on to spreadsheets to do rating and weighting. And then once all that's done, a lot of the commitments are lost between what was agreed to in the RFI and RFP and responses and the contracts. And then it's got to go over to contracting, which is another act of Word or a word processing tool. So by having it all in, go ahead, please, Tom.
I'm sorry. I just wanted there was several questions about one of the later slides about do you weigh math, physics, and chemistry equally in the equation? And I'll give you my answer. Then Paul, you can give your answer.
Yeah, please.
So my answer is not at all, because every different project for me, there's different requirements that have to happen. For projects that are fairly new and the business units are new at outsourcing and it's a new technology that we're outsourcing, I would weigh the chemistry a little higher than some of the other factors. If it's a very commodity-based operation that I'm trying to outsource, and I know the cost is pretty much easy, you know, they have to meet certain cost bases. It's a transaction process. Cost is really important. I don't need to have a lot of chemistry, and the physics is not that important. So at that point, price might be 2/3 of my evaluation criteria. So it really depends on your mix, and what I always suggest clients to do is look at those 3 ingredients, detail what they are, and then put your weightings against each individual task. Don't go into your general outsourcing that they all have to have the same weighting.
There'd be nothing more that I could add to that, Don.
Thanks,
Next
Paul.
slide, please. So what happens in the decision weighting process? So most frequently, and this is historic data we've seen over the last 2 years, and literally hundreds of vendor selection processes. So the typical standard process, the decision is mostly made based on the existing relationship with the vendor, be it an incumbent or a salesperson that they like, as the experience during the sales process, plus the cost. And if you notice in the bar chart over to the left, the preferred approach should be around the proven capabilities and the value, not just the cost, the value, which includes the quality, then followed by the experience during the sales process, kind of lagging more than anything. Obviously, the relationship is meaningful, but it shouldn't be the driver. So certainly the preferred approach offers a change in the weighting. But again, as Donald pointed out, it really is specific to your engagement. You've just got to be careful not to put too much emphasis in the wrong area. Donald, any comments?
Nope, that's good.
Okay, so let's get to the real benefits here. Next slide, please. So what are we really talking about? Yeah. It's really about doing this faster, better, cheaper, safer, and greener. So one of the questions that was offered up during the webinar was, if I've got an existing staff who's capable of producing RFPs today, certainly it makes sense to be able to do those consistently. Certainly it makes sense to be able to get them out faster and get responses faster and get a consummated transaction quicker. So if using an accelerator tool can help you get to a contract, a mutually agreeable contract, standard wording and language, quicker, then that's extremely meaningful to get a vendor selected in 3 months versus 6 months. Assuming you're doing it for cost savings reasons, you just picked up 3 more months of cost savings. From a better perspective, it is about higher quality and consistency. So instead of having the one very smart person who knows exactly what they're doing with an RFP process continue to do that type of RFP, allow many people to produce similar quality RFPs by instantiating that person's knowledge in a knowledge-based system that offers a level of reuse that's way beyond cut and paste. Obviously, if you take 3 months to do an RFP process or select a vendor versus 6 months, there are cost savings associated with getting it done quicker. It's also much safer because, one, you can involve a lot more people in an electronic process who can review vendor responses or just certain sections of vendor responses, who can have input to the process and understand why a vendor was chosen. You actually build consensus for the winning vendor along the way, given more people that you involve. From a greener perspective, you actually save a lot of paper by using one of the accelerator tools. Don, any comments?
Well, I agree with all your points. I think from a buyer perspective, the two things that I notice is that when it's safer, I think security, and I think we have to go through a process to look at more of the security and of an outsourcing project. Where are we going to be putting the work? How are we evaluating the security, the land security, the physical security, the geographic security of the facility that we're going to? I'm a big fan of, you can do all the evaluation you want. You still need to visit the facility if it's a new vendor. You still need to conduct due diligence on the facility itself to make sure that that's done. And that's a tougher thing to do with a tool. I mean, it's an important aspect, but look at a tool, but also look at the other things that we need to do in terms of kicking the tires of the business, and the facility that we are outsourcing to is going to be very important as we go over the next few years.
Yeah, Donald, it's really interesting. We've seen these tools mature so much in the market recently, and when we put them in buyers' hands, they go, but wait a minute, this doesn't do due diligence for me. Wait a minute, this doesn't help me judge, if I like these folks. That's all correct, right? The tool is not intended to be a panacea. It's not intended to be a substitute for bilateral due diligence. As you pointed out, you've got to go. You've got to meet these people. You've got to check their references. These tools will accelerate the process. They won't perform the process for you, very simply stated. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about an improved vendor selection process. Let's go through some of the metrics we've accumulated. So if you look at the various roles throughout selecting a vendor, a buyer, an evaluator, a negotiator, all of these roles sit on the buyer side. If you were to build and conduct an RFP process and select a vendor, and you were to do it on your own, by yourself, you had no former pieces of work to leverage, either your own or from others. A typical process would take you around 26 weeks, and you'd consume 525 hours. And some of those are being kind, right? Developing the master services agreement could certainly take more than 120 hours, assuming each of us had the capability to do that. More likely, the scenario is in the middle. where you've got the ability to use or reuse point solutions, meaning stuff in Excel that's been done before, stuff in a word processing tool that's been done before. And you could cut and paste out of those and cobble together a good RFP and develop a good spreadsheet form of a rating and weighting tool, and then go through some legacy contracts and cut and paste from those and come up with some decent end products that are perfectly acceptable. And that'll cut your time, in half. It'll go from 26 weeks to 12 weeks. And we'll take your hours down, too, significantly, more to something like 167 hours over a period of time, obviously. If you were to do the same activities using one of these Outsourcing Accelerator tools, where it's more so being asked intelligent questions, and based on your response, it's selecting components for you to include in the requirements, and then using the same tool to perform the evaluation, so not a spreadsheet, right? Something in a tool that's an actual database, that's a rating and weighting engine, where you could have essentially unlimited number of people evaluating whole or portions of vendor responses, and then literally hitting a button to generate a best-of-breed set of agreements, which is a huge savings. So we've seen clients go from doing an original piece of work, a 30-page RFP going out to 5 vendors, to doing that same task in under 6 weeks, and essentially only investing 48 hours. So it's certainly faster, certainly higher quality and consistency. Donald, any comments on the metrics?
Well, I think the time frame is really, most of the time it gets underestimated how much effort is needed to do these correctly. And I think when I look at these numbers, the reality is it's probably more because you've got to pull information together, you've got to validate information internally before it's outsourcing. So when you look at these numbers and you look at the benefit of using a consistent tool versus what I've done in the past, which is Word and Excel, you can get even better benefits of having a consistent tool. And I think that's something you really need to look at. So these numbers are great, but I've always been amazed how much effort and time it's taken to do RFPs, especially when you're looking at new vendors, when you cannot or don't want to leverage existing vendors.
Arlene, next slide, please. So what's the benefit to using an accelerated approach to vendor selection? There's certainly a cost savings, and let's just assume everybody's time is worth $100 an hour. Right, if you're a first-time developer of an outsourcing RFP, you can save yourself 450 personal hours of effort. So that's a $45,000 savings. If you're a seasoned developer of an RFP, to take all your knowledge and instantiate it in a tool, so it's just point and click, and connect the RFP to the responses, to the evaluation, to the contracts, certainly it's going to save you 100 hours. And these are conservative numbers. What about from a time-saving perspective? What's it worth to get an RFP done 20 weeks sooner? Or even if you're a seasoned user, 6 weeks sooner? Right? That's up to you, right? What's it worth to your business to get that transaction completed sooner? Get the vendor engaged and start saving money or increasing revenues, depending on the value proposition. What about from a quality and consistency standpoint? Right? What's it worth to have multiple people being able to produce standardized, solid RFPs that are best of breed, that have good service level agreements in them, right? Ones that have been vetted and tested in the industry. And I cite that because that's the area where we always see contracts fall down, is terrible SLAs for the most part. Right? What's it worth to have a consistent set of contractual agreements going out to these vendors? Again, that's something you have to decide. Donald?
Well, I was going to say, SLAs are always the tough ones in there. Again, the point I always look for is you want to be able to provide as much detail as you can. SLAs are important, but I think the consistency, the quality consistency of an RFP is so important. And too many times we myself included, I've got to get an RFP and RFI done, and I rush through it, and I think I'm going to get the information later on. Or I think I'll go back to that checklist that I had, and I'll make sure I include everything later on. Or I'll get the SLAs done during a due diligence event with the vendor. The reality is you don't, and you get busy with other stuff. And the reality of using a tool that provides and forces a buyer to be consistent and make sure you go through all the pieces is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, by the way, these accelerator tools that we've seen used effectively, they have as many as 200 sample SLAs in them, where the tool will make a recommendation as to the ones you should include, but you can also include others or write your own. But it's nice to know that you've got a set of vetted best-of-breed SLAs that have made their way into a contract and have been executed against historically. It's really meaningful to have that kind of information available at your fingertips. Next slide, please. Great. We certainly appreciate you joining us for the session. Again, my name is Paul Pinto. I'm a managing partner at Sylvan Advisory. We do quite a bit of work on both the buy side and the sell side associated with buyers selecting vendors and vendors who are interested in entering into new markets. Donald, please.
Yeah, so I do appreciate everyone being involved, and I think that the one thing that I do want to add that has to be considered is going through this process and documenting the process is great. The one thing that we all have to be concerned with is when we have discussions with the potential vendors outside the process. And it's something that you've got to be aware of. It's not always a bad thing. But if you want to be consistent, you've got to make sure that everybody has all the same information so that the decision can be made based on the facts. And providing one vendor with some information over another just leads to problems. So again, you've got to be very cautious about the process you go to. Whether it's the large vendor or a small vendor, you want to remain consistent and impartial and make the decision based on the facts that they present to you.
Great, Donald, thank you. Arlene, can I turn it over to you?
Sure. I'll just close the webinar now. I want to mention I saw a lot of questions come in regarding receiving or how to access this webinar in the future and how to get slides. In the follow-up letter you'll receive in approximately 2 days, there will be a link where you'll be able to access the recorded webinar from today as well as the presentation slides. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Paul Pinto and Donald Moniz, for joining us. And on behalf of the Outsourcing Institute, I'd like to thank all of you for joining the vendor selection webinar today. Thank you.